So we've already looked at Eisenhower's as far as foreign policy and the Dulles diplomacy and the brinksmanship, massive retaliation, all that sort of stuff. And with Eisenhower's presidency, I would argue that those events, foreign policy events, foreign policy happenings, and the real confrontational attitude in the Cold War and further developments in the Cold War are probably some of the things when we consider Eisenhower that are probably going to come to the top of the list as far as notable moments and things where Eisenhower had direct contribution to the way things were done and the way things turned out. Domestically, Eisenhower's policy is far less articulated. There is not a specific, agenda. There is not a specific program. There's not a specific, line that Eisenhower really took to a lot of that. And there's a reason for that. It's not just that he didn't have one. There's a reason why he kind of didn't. So we're going to talk about his domestic policy is not super specific. There's not a whole lot to it. It's again more you're going to see here from Eisenhower when it comes to the Cold War stuff and confronting communism and the massive retaliation and all of that. So we're just going to hit a little bit on what some of the basics were, kind of the one big thing that's sort of part of Eisenhower's domestic policy, and then Eisenhower's reaction to other domestic issues that were not of his making, but the beginnings and the growth of the upcoming civil rights movement. So Eisenhower, we've already kind of doing this backwards. We talked about Eisenhower's presidency in relation to foreign policy already, so we already know him a little bit. We know him from World War II for sure. Eisenhower's elected as a result of the election of 1952, which we're not going to go into any specifics about the dynamics of that election or who he was running against or any of those things. You can read about them. But the election of 1952, we see Eisenhower elected. Eisenhower's a Republican, first Republican in the White House in quite some time. And Eisenhower, was a political outsider. What's Eisenhower's background been in? In the military, of course. He's not a career politician. Perhaps that was some of his appeal in 1952. People, every once in a while kind of get fed up with career politicians. And Eisenhower was someone with, an incredible record, kind of a squeaky clean record as far as honesty. He's a big war hero, all of that. And there were various issues in the election. Probably one of the big ones was Korea. This was in the middle of the Korean conflict, which was in a stalemate. Eisenhower, among other things, runs on this promise that he would personally go to Korea himself, that he would personally go there himself and end the conflict, which it does end up getting, not resolved, that's not the right word, but the conflict ends, with an armistice not long after his election. But perhaps that disillusionment with the stalemate in Korea, disillusioned with how the lack of progress, the bickering between Truman and MacArthur that we talked about over Korea, and the fact that Eisenhower was a military man. So, who better to end a military conflict than a military general? So he is elected in 1952. But he is, although a Republican, he kind of wants to bring about, or he would argue for kind of a different brand of Republicanism. So to bring about some changes, but not all changes. Eisenhower is a president that really, I don't want it to sound like he was not a strong leader, because he was. But Eisenhower kind of reverts back to an understanding of the president when it came to domestic issues, when it came to things happening at home, that the president should, and the federal government really, should defer a lot of that to the states. And that the president was yes, a leader, but was also, more of an enforcer and, to do what Congress did, or to do what Congress asked him to do, rather. That the president was not to be a creator of policy, that it was Congress's job to create policy and the president's job to do what Congress wanted. And so when I was mentioning earlier that Eisenhower doesn't have like a real specific domestic program, the way that, say, FDR had the New Deal and Truman had the Fair Deal, and some of them have like these specific things and specific goals, Eisenhower really didn't have that. It's not because he didn't know what he wanted to do. It's because he believed that was really up to Congress to make those kinds of decisions, and that it was up to individual states So he called this whole thing moderate republicanism or dynamic conservatism, that more of the domestic issues, for one thing, should be left for states to handle. That the federal government should not abandon, certain things, that he doesn't want to get rid of New Deal programs. He accepted those things as just kind of being part of life by this time. Things like Social Security, for example. Republicans had typically opposed a lot of that stuff. Eisenhower didn't want to get rid of it, but he wanted to kind of pull back, not get rid of New Deal programs, not get rid of all that, but kind of pull back on it a little bit. So he calls this whole domestic plan dynamic conservatism, which referred partly to that of letting the states have more control. The federal government kind of backing off a little bit, not dismantling things, not getting rid of it, but just kind of not being quite so active. Dynamic conservatism also emphasized fiscal restraint. What's fiscal mean? Yeah, spending. Fiscal means money and spending. So not spending so much. So decreasing spending, balancing the budget. We saw that with actually with some of his foreign policy. That massive retaliation was meant to partially to decrease defense spending. Not have such a large standing army because you're going to use, massive weapons if something happens. So decreasing spending, balancing the budget, unlike, sort of the New Dealer version of things, less regulation, less taxes, but, keeping some of those social programs and things that were created by the New Deal intact. So it's not a complete reversal to say your 1920s conservatism of the government being completely hands-off and not having any regulation of business and no New Deal programs or anything like that, but a little bit in between, kind of a middle of the road. Eisenhower likes to, portray himself as a middle of the road kind of person, not particularly strong either way. And again, it should not suggest that he was not a strong leader or that he just didn't want to do anything, let states handle it. That wasn't it at all. But he was someone that believed the president should lead in some ways. Clearly, we see him doing that in foreign policy. And he was definitely behind the scenes pulling lots of strings. But he also was a great delegator, believed in delegating certain tasks to certain departments, individuals, to the states, and that's how a lot of things like that should be handled. Now, as far as, domestic programs, again, there's not like a specific agenda with a catchy name and a title and all that kind of stuff like some of Eisenhower's predecessors had. One of the domestic programs that Eisenhower does get associated with, one of the things that he did want to do and that was done successfully, was the passage of the Federal Aid Highway Act. And what that did was it created the interstate system, which we know well. Many of us travel the interstates all the time. And that was created by this law, and that was something that Eisenhower saw as an important part of a domestic agenda. The interesting thing about the interstates, which of course are begun to be built in the 1950s here and then continue to be built, even now. That word interstate, meaning connecting states together, right? And interstate highways do what? They go through, just like highways do, yes, but they're faster and, more direct, more efficient. You can get places a lot faster on the interstate than you can on highways and back roads and that sort of thing. So it was meant to be an efficient, fast, effective mode of transportation, but originally for military purposes. Some of you may know that the interstate system proposed by Eisenhower and starting, construction beginning in the 1950s, this was part of Cold War policy. This was a reaction to the arms race, militarism, and all of that. This is about military preparedness originally. So the reason that this idea was conceived originally was this was about mobilization. If a war occurs, nuclear war or otherwise, the United States wanted to be ready to mobilize very quickly. And that meant being able to get troops, being able to get weapons, supplies, food, whatever the case may be, to get them to various sites very, very quickly. And so that was the original reason for the interstates. Of course, in the end, they turn out to, while they would probably be very useful in those situations, they turn out to be, of course, a big part of the economic expansion of the 1950s that we talked about. It is a part of that economic prosperity. Because in order to build all these interstates, think of all the jobs that creates. Think of all of the business that brings to certain parts of the country. Think of all of the travel that's now going to happen because of those interstates, leisure travel. And, what else are more people buying more of in the 1950s that would contribute to that? Cars, yes. We've seen this car culture and more people having more time for leisure and going on vacations. And so we see vacation spots and motels, for the first time, and, all kinds of things that are developing economically around that. So while it's meant originally for a defensive purpose, it's not said that it doesn't serve that purpose. It also contributes greatly to the economic stimulation, to tourism, consumerism, car culture, oil dependency, all those kind of things go along with it as well. Less people traveling on trains, more people traveling on cars and utilizing those interstate systems for that efficient and effective travel. Now, Eisenhower himself, it's not so much, I would not really call him a proponent necessarily of the civil rights movement, but some of the early major demonstrations and major events, which I know a lot of you are going to be very familiar with some of these things, you probably have studied them before, that occur in the 1950s, of course, happen on Eisenhower's watch. And Eisenhower, in some cases, takes direct action and sometimes not. But we're going to take a look at how this movement is starting to gain traction and gain national attention, develop an identity, develop a strategy, develop unity and cohesion, and start to gain momentum in the South, where, of course, we know segregation and racial discrimination have been plaguing and holding people back since, forever, certainly since the end of the Civil War, even further than that. Now, the civil rights movement, it doesn't happen overnight. We know that there have been tensions and there have been people working to end racial discrimination ever, since as far back as you can remember. But certainly, the war had caused, with its emphasis on fighting for freedom and fighting for democracy and ending bigotry and fighting against Nazism, that have caused more people to question the racial situation in the United States. How can we, if we're going to fight for these things, literally fight for these things, how can we tolerate it at home? Now, President Truman earlier had desegregated the military, so there were starting to be some kind of baby steps along the way, as well as a few other things. But that starts to bring attention, again, the war and other kinds of the desegregation of the military and so forth, start to bring more attention to these real inconsistencies in American society. It is difficult to say. I don't like to really say there's a moment where the modern civil rights movement begins, because it really had been growing and building, and the seeds for this have been planted generations before. However, if we want to pick kind of one of many moments that really could be looked at as kind of a spark, one of those might be the landmark court case that I know you probably have heard of before, Brown versus the Board of Education, which was issued by the Supreme Court in 1955. This is a case, again, I don't doubt all of you know what the end result was, but I do want to make sure we point out a few things that are relevant to this case that happened previously. And the reason I want to make sure we point it out is this is some of the stuff that got either skipped over because the way last year ended or because of the way this year began. So this is stuff that in the future I probably won't have to go over at this point, but we need to go over it now. Brown versus Board of Education. Okay, first of all, if you're not aware, this of course is the case involving the African-American school children. One particular child, that's where this case came from. They were arguing against segregation in public schools, arguing that school segregation was unconstitutional, that was denying African-American school children equal protection under the law. That was a violation of the 14th Amendment to have them go to segregated schools, which were further away from their homes, which were not as well equipped, where teachers did not have the same kind of textbooks, the same kind of facilities, so forth and so on, saying that this is not equal protection under the law. And as most of you probably know, what did the Supreme Court argue, or what was their ruling in this case? That segregation in public schools is unconstitutional. So they overturned a previous decision. So let me go back for just a second. So if you didn't know, Brown versus Board of Education, landmark Supreme Court decision where the Supreme Court ruled, majority opinion, that segregation in public schools, not segregation everywhere, but segregation in public schools was unconstitutional. this overturned what I want to get at. That's kind of something we should have already gone over, but we kind of either didn't or we may have missed it because of the circumstances of the past 6 months, 7 months, 8 months. I don't even know anymore. Who knows? Was this overturned a previous decision called Plessy versus Ferguson? Some of you have heard of Plessy versus Ferguson, some of you might not have, but you need to know it if you don't. And Brown versus Board of Education reverses, it overturns the previous ruling in Plessy versus Ferguson, which was issued back in 1896. Plessy versus Ferguson, this was a case involving racial segregation. In this case, it was about train cars or streetcars. And this man, Homer Plessy, who was partially African American, he was a mixed race, rather light skinned, but he was told to move from a white car to an African American car on the train. And of course, he sued, said that violated the 14th Amendment, the constitutional part in question, because remember, if you're going to say something's unconstitutional, you got to have a specific part of the Constitution that it violates. He was arguing that violated his equal protection under the law as required by the 14th Amendment. 14th Amendment is another thing that I'm a little concerned some of you don't know well, because that's also something that was the part of last year where we were not actually in school. But that was one of your Reconstruction amendments that, among other things, probably the most important thing, probably the most important of all the Reconstruction amendments, that guaranteed equal protection under the law, basically equality, legal equality of all citizens. Well, in Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896, the Supreme Court ruled that segregation did not violate the 14th Amendment. They upheld it. So Plessy is where they upheld racial segregation, saying that was not a violation of the 14th Amendment. That was not taking away anybody's rights under the 14th Amendment, as long as the facilities were equal. This is where the famous, or rather infamous, separate but equal doctrine came from. That came from Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896. So separate but equal, saying that segregation was constitutional. It did not violate the 14th Amendment as long as facilities were equal. So you could do that, and southern states had free license to have racial segregation, have separate seats in trains, on buses, in schools, in theaters, in public places, different bathrooms, different water fountains, all that, provided it was quote unquote equal. So you could have a white school as long as you had an African American school too. Now, of course, we know, which is what was argued in the Brown versus Board of Education case, is these facilities were never equal. You had white schools that were well equipped, with well funded, with textbooks and equipment and libraries and all kinds of things, where African American schools got a fraction of that, where they were using outdated textbooks that were the ones that the white schools didn't want, so forth and so on. I'm sure you've seen the images of the water fountain for white patrons and then the one for African American patrons, and plenty of businesses and theaters and things like that didn't admit African Americans at all. So we know that it was never equal. But that was the legal doctrine, that was the legal understanding for that amount of time. Brown versus Board of Education overturns the Plessy decision, where they say separate, at least in public schools, is inherently unequal. That it is inherently unequal. That even if you did have exactly the same school with exactly the same stuff, if you are separating children based on their race and telling children that they have to go to this school because of their race, that is inherently unequal, that you're treating them differently because of the color of their skin, and therefore that is not equal and that's not constitutional. So they were overturning that and saying that segregation in public schools was unlawful. So does that mean that all the southern states integrated all their schools? No, of course not. The reaction to this, of course, is fierce and sometimes ugly. Southern states are appalled by that and are not about to start desegregating their schools. In many cases, that won't happen until they're literally forced to, in even the 1970s, and many of them segregated by de facto reasons even today. But in the South, of course, there is no integration of schools. Even though the Supreme Court ruled that they needed to desegregate with, quote, all deliberate speed, there's no other. Eisenhower is not going to enforce it. He believed, and he did not want to take an active role in any kind of civil rights, anything. He kind of wanted to stay away from the civil rights issue. He saw it as too divisive. He saw it as being a state thing, that was something that states needed to handle on their own. He talked about his overall kind of vision of domestic policy, that states needed to handle things. He, like a lot of politicians before him, worried about alienating Southerners. They needed white Southern support in order to win elections and such, and he didn't want to alienate any of those people. So Eisenhower does not take any action on behalf of the federal government immediately in trying to enforce this. So Southern states are resisting. Some of them, some Southern states claiming to nullify, we talked about nullification before, nullify that decision, saying that they're not going to enforce it, many of them just ignoring it, starting to kind of organize themselves for what is soon to be a lot of resistance against Supreme Court decisions and federal actions and so forth, in enforcing civil rights legislation, integration, all that kind of thing. So they're kind of militarizing in that sense. Even when you do start to see some integration, you'll see the establishment of a lot of private schools, things like that. It's interesting how many private schools in the southern region, if you look at the establishment dates, it's amazing how many of them were established between like 1955 and 1975. And there were reasons for that. Not for all of them, but for a lot of them. So the Brown decision is, of course, a big deal that is getting some momentum. It's bringing attention, although it does not mean the immediate desegregation of schools, at least not just yet. But we have had the Supreme Court of the United States say that segregation is unlawful in schools. And so that, of course, brings about more action to protest segregation in other areas. And the movement is going to continue to grow and continue to gain steam. Certainly, one of the other first big events, momentous events of the civil rights movement, and one that I know is incredibly familiar to all of us, as it is part of Alabama history, as a lot of civil rights history is, as well as American history, of course, is the very famous, very important Montgomery bus boycott. Like all other facilities and areas of most southern cities, Montgomery's city buses were segregated. Not only were they segregated, but African American passengers had to sit toward the back ends of the bus. And as the buses filled up with white passengers, what would African American passengers have to do? Give up their seats and stand. And this had been protested before. There had been, this was not a random thing. This was not the first time it happened. When Rosa Parks was arrested, as you all know, Rosa Parks, there had been, attempts to not really integrate buses yet, but there had been grassroots movements to just change the way it was done, so that African Americans were not essentially being humiliated and not being treated badly, because it wasn't just the segregation. I mean, bus drivers, people were just rude and obnoxious and just, didn't treat people fairly, weren't treated with respect, and a lot of African Americans were simply asking for that. And of course, the Montgomery bus boycott begins in December of 1955, when Rosa Parks is infamously arrested when she refuses to give up her seat to a white passenger. And she was not the first one. There had been arrests made before that, but her arrest sparked the boycott. And it was also not completely random. I mean, it was, I don't want to say intentional and like trying to cause trouble, but they needed something to spark a movement, something to spark a massive protest. And they needed someone like Rosa Parks to do that, someone who was respectable, someone that was, was not a troublemaker, was not someone that had been, didn't have a record and stuff like that in order to do so. So it was very well organized from the very, very beginning. And so her arrest, of course, sparked this more than a year-long bus boycott where African American patrons refused to ride Montgomery city buses. And that accounted for about 3/4 of their riders, probably about 75% or so of the patrons using the city buses were African Americans who used the buses to get to their jobs, to get to wherever they needed to go in the city. So that brought about a huge decrease, a huge dent in their money and their profits. And they found other ways to organize a massive effort, because it's not just not riding the buses. The bus boycott is so much more than that. It's so much bigger than that, because if they're not going to ride buses, people have to find a way to get to work. They've got to find a way to get to where they need to be and live their lives and go to their jobs. And so they organized carpools. They organized people that had a car, and they would have meeting places, and they utilized churches and other kinds of centers in their communities to make sure people had a ride to work, all those kind of things, or providing rides to other kind of people. Also in the Montgomery bus boycott, of course, is where we see the national emergence of another person that I'm sure needs no explanation. This is where we start to see the national emergence of Martin Luther King, who at the time was pastor of Montgomery Church, Dexter Avenue Baptist Church, who becomes the charismatic and the leader, the voice of not only this particular protest and this particular demonstration, but eventually of the movement, which is about to start growing and growing and growing itself. And becoming a voice for this entire community, and emphasizing and really articulating its overall strategy of nonviolence, civil disobedience. Those become the themes and the tactics that King emphasized and that we use throughout his career as a civil rights leader. Just like with the Montgomery bus boycott, not being violent, not getting in people's face, just either we'll see more of the civil disobedience later, but passively, but in a unified way, in a peaceful way, protesting the city bus systems. And of course, what was the end result of this? Did it work? Yes, it did. It took about a year, took a little bit more than a year, and there were lawsuits going on at the same time. So after just shy of a year, Montgomery City buses are forced to integrate, and the day after that, African American patrons begin riding those city buses again. They do win a federal case against racial segregation on city buses, and that ended the boycott. So we have, of course, the initial result and initial significance in that this ended racial segregation on Montgomery city buses. Keep in mind, you're just talking about on city buses in Montgomery, not necessarily all kinds of racial discrimination or segregation. But the Montgomery bus boycott also signified or demonstrated certain things nationally. It showed the power of African American activism. It showed how effective that could be, how being unified together, everybody being on the same page, showed that nonviolence could work, that civil disobedience could work, that things like boycotts and things like this sort of unified nonviolent protest could be very effective. And so, of course, that leads to leaders or individuals or groups in other areas thinking, if that works there, then perhaps it can work here. So it starts to spark other movements and other attempts to do the same thing. And so we're going to start to see more movements like this growing in the years following the Montgomery bus boycott, from sit-ins to other bus boycotts to other types of demonstrations. So we're going to continue to see a lot of that. But that, of course, was first really demonstrated nationally, and everybody in the country watching it with the Montgomery bus boycott. It also propels Dr. King to national prominence, and he becomes, not just a leader in Montgomery, but a leader nationally of the growing civil rights movement. Now, I mentioned that, I'll get to that in a second. Another thing that happens, getting ahead of myself, in the wake of the Montgomery bus boycott, so there is a lot of hope and a lot of anticipation of perhaps more effectiveness that can come. In order to keep that momentum going and to keep that, making sure that the momentum doesn't just die off with the integration of Montgomery's bus systems, in the wake of the Montgomery bus boycott, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference is formed. You will often just see that abbreviated to SCLC, because obviously that's a mouthful to say, kind of long. So the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, this is going to become a civil rights organization, a group dedicated to civil rights leadership. King being a part of and a leader in the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. So many future demonstrations and movements and so forth are going to be coordinated by, led by, supported by, influenced by the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. So they wanted to make sure that it didn't end with Montgomery, that they could continue that process and continue organizing and being unified together and bringing attention to their movement, and continue to use those same tactics in other places to bring about more change. Now, this does prompt some action from the federal government. It does lead to The Civil Rights Acts, there's two different ones. We're just combining them together. Civil Rights Acts of 1957 and 1960. Now, although these civil rights laws are not going to bring about really big sweeping changes, they're still important because this is the first time that the federal government has enacted any kind of civil rights legislation since Reconstruction. So although their effectiveness will be minimal at first, it's not going to do a whole lot at first. It is a step. It's a baby step, and it is, a response to the demonstrations that have been taking place. It's a response to the work and the commitment of those organizers and these people that were oppressed, that were speaking out against it. The Civil Rights Act of 1957 and 1960. I don't want to go too specific into the different things that they required, but it created a civil rights, basically like a civil rights division within the Justice Department. So kind of giving the federal government, trying to give the federal government anyway, a bit more teeth to enforce civil rights legislation and to look into violations of civil rights and so forth, just trying to give them a little bit more of a platform with which to actually go after some of those things. Now, at the same time, while it is doing that, it really wasn't enough just yet. So you won't see too much happening just yet because they watered it. There were some people in Congress opposed to it, that it ends up getting watered down a whole lot. Like, in order to get both of these laws passed, they had to really whittle away at it to where it wasn't really all that effective. So it doesn't really mean that a whole lot of civil rights cases are going to get prosecuted. There were provisions in here about voting and stuff. Neither of these are going to mean that any additional people in the South, African Americans, are going to get to vote. That's going to come later. But it is kind of a baby step in that direction. And again, the first time the federal government has taken any action on civil rights in nearly a century by that point. So that's still pretty significant. Now, I mentioned that Eisenhower himself is not exactly a huge advocate for civil rights, not necessarily an advocate against them, except to the extent that he thought that should be a state thing. It was something that the federal government ought to stay out of. Nevertheless, he does believe in the rule of law, and so that will lead him to intervene in another incident involving the growing civil rights movement in Little Rock, Arkansas. Many of you are familiar with this story as well. Central High School, not our next door neighbor, but another Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas, was to be racially integrated. This is 1957. And there were 9, in response to Brown versus Board of Education. Of course, there was not massive integration, but it does start happening slowly. And in 1957, there were 9 African American students that were set to enroll and be present at Central High School, and all what had previously been an all-white school, of course, in Little Rock, Arkansas. And the governor of Arkansas, being ever defiant, as many Southern governors and Southern leaders were, saying there was no way they were going to allow their schools to be integrated, and they would rather shut schools down. Plenty of them did. Some of them for a short amount of time, some of them for longer amounts of time. But the governor was refusing to allow these 9 African American students entrance into the school. Some of you've heard them called the Little Rock 9, those 9 students. And so Eisenhower, though not a idealist and not a, getting wrapped up in the ideology of the civil rights movement, but ultimately believing in the rule of law, reluctantly dispatched federal marshals to Little Rock to force the segregation of Little Rock High School, to make sure that those 9 students were able to enter the school, to make sure they were able to go into the school building and actually attend their classes, because the governor was threatening to block them. And there were, of course, crowds of people outside of the school every day, yelling, screaming, hollering terrible things at these poor children, some of them your age. And they remained there all school year. Those federal marshals escorted those 9 students to class, sat with them in class every single day, in order to enforce those court rulings. So it is, again, not an example of Eisenhower exactly taking the moral high road, but definitely using federal power to enforce integration, and we're going to see more of that in a few other instances a bit later on. So the civil rights movement is gaining momentum, and all these events, just continue to bring more attention, continue to bring more of a spotlight on further issues. And we're seeing that movement further gain clarity, further gain unity, and we will really see it gain even much more momentum and start to get more national attention and the attention of presidential administrations under Kennedy and Johnson in the 60s, which we'll look at later this week and early next week. Okay, so keep that there, and we'll continue to build on that. Okay, questions on any of that? All right. So let me